Thank you for coming out to hear this message tonight. It's something I believe very strongly in, or I wouldn't put myself out here for criticism at some point if you guys want to debate any of my facts or the things I want to share with you. But this is a talk about, well, as he said, I'm a teacher at Siena Heights, and I've been working in addictions for 15 years. I've been working with people in literally the worst parts of their life for almost 2 decades, actually. And I've got a few things to say about what I've learned from those experiences. So tonight, the talk is about addiction. And it's about breaking the chains of addiction, really. It's more than just, we're going to talk about how the brain gets addicted, but how do we get out of this mess that we're in? We need to set our souls free, and I'm not overstating the fact there, believe me. So I have 3 parts to this talk. I want us to examine the scope of the problem. Snapchat is an example of where is this happening and what's happening on Snapchat and a lot of other places where addiction happens. I want to examine the impact it's having on us. And in particular, I'm going to show you and talk to you about the impact it's having on our brains, which I think is going to be very shocking to you. But finally, I will leave us with a reason to hope. We can become unshackled from our addictions. I know, I see it happen all the time. And in the end, I will share with you the first 2 steps that everyone must take to get out of their addictions. Okay? So that's coming at the end. Let's begin by taking a look at the state of affairs in the United States. And as we think about addiction, let's open our minds and think about all of the ways in which we can become addicted to things. Okay? Later on, I'll share how and why we become so addicted, why our minds are so susceptible to addiction, why our society is so addicted, and I'm going to talk about how to protect against addiction and how to resolve our addictions. We're at a time now in our own individual lives and in our lives as a society where it's time to take a stand. These addictions rule and ruin our lives. It's time to know the enemy and face him head on. So with that said, let's look at the word addiction. You got the tone for the talk already, right? It's going to be serious. During the Q&A, we'll have time to be a little more extemporaneous, but I got to get some information out to you first. So addictions obviously go way beyond just drug addictions, if that's what first comes to mind. And they're certainly more than just bad habits, although they are certainly that too. Addictions are, textbook definition, compulsive behavior despite negative consequences. Thank you for laughing. Or a brother in arms, literally my brother-in-law, so. Or repeatedly doing something that hurts us and others, because addictions hurt us and they hurt everyone around us. The way I think about addictions now, they are a form of slow suicide. Unfortunately, I've had lots of people sitting in a chair across from me who are so suicidal they can barely sit down. But addictions they're a slow suicide. They're the same thing. They're destroying us, mind, body, and soul, starting in the brain. So we have to think of addictions as literally having our brain in shackles. It's literally like a form of mental slavery, where it feels, and I know what you and I both know what this feels like we're not in complete control, sort of a marionette to a part of ourselves that we just can't quite control. I'll paraphrase Paul in Romans. I do not understand why I do what I hate. Now, many of us manage our addictions pretty well. Some of us actually have considerable leverage over them. Others wouldn't even know that we're addicted. But some of us have no leverage over our addictions. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, addictions are black and white, either you have them or you don't have them, that's not true. Patterns of self-harm fall on a spectrum just like every illness. When I diagnose a mental illness, I diagnose it as mild, moderate, or severe. And that's the way we need to think about addictions. It's not a question of, am I addicted to this phone in my pocket or not? But am I mildly, moderately, or severely addicted? The idea that we're not addicted to something in our lives probably isn't reality. So when we go to college, they teach us about this word called denial. But this is what it looks like. I wish I were standing in a room as a person full of brothers and sisters where we didn't have addictions. I hope we're there someday, but we aren't there today. Even if your addictions in your life don't feel this severe, you don't feel dramatically pushed around by them, addictions are still a mental bully in our brains. That bully's a monster, by the way, which we ourselves create. Granted, that monster gets made oftentimes under duress in a misguided attempt at protecting ourselves from pain, but addictions are almost always a condition of our own creation. It's a condition which ultimately isolates us from our true self and from the deep, meaningful relationships we desperately need in our lives. Now, the story of why we seem to have such a propensity toward addictions and other self-destructive behaviors begins, frankly, back in the Garden of Eden. But we can't pin this whole thing just on Adam and Eve, right? That doesn't explain the entire state of affairs that we have. It's a denial of our own free will to some extent. After all, we have to admit, that ancient story persists in our lives every day. There isn't a day that goes by that we don't reach for some kind of forbidden fruit. And that forbidden fruit is quite literally damaging our beautiful brains. Now, we all know the so-called hard drugs are bad for us, but just how bad are they? What are they doing to our brains? And how many of us are actually struggling with hard drugs? 23.5 million Americans are addicted to drugs or alcohol. That's 1 out of 10 of us over the age of 12. And the sad news here is that only 1 out of 10 of them are getting any help. That's 1% of us getting help. And that is extremely disheartening because it means that 10% of our neighbors are walking around with brains that look like honeycombs. This is a SPECT scan. It's a 3D map which shows blood flow in the brain. You can see where blood is not flowing, and you are sitting there instinctively going, I know my brain is not supposed to look like that image on the right. It's not. It's supposed to look like the one on the left. So this is what a drug-addicted brain looks like. Here's what a brain looks like for someone who's 28 years old and has been using marijuana recreationally on the weekends for 10 years. Here's what a brain looks like of a 44-year-old male who had 3 to 4 alcoholic drinks every night for 20 years. Doesn't look good, does it? So who does this stuff to their brains? Well, we're in a high school, so I'm going to tell you some of what's happening with our high school students. 10% of high school seniors are abusing amphetamines like Adderall. Some are using it under prescription for the very effective treatment of ADHD, actually. But they're abusing it. And when we look at colleges, 30% of kids there are using Adderall and other amphetamines and some of the dirtier amphetamines called methamphetamines. 30% are buying and selling Adderall down here at our universities. What about heroin use? Well, that's quadrupled over the last decade. There are clinics, you've heard of methadone clinics, but there are clinics in Canada now where people are going in and shooting up heroin in a clinic where a nurse and a therapist and a doctor are, because the cities are tired of these people shooting up in alleyways and dying. They want them to come into a clinic where they can shoot up and get help. It's a very controversial idea, but we have to do something because the methadone clinics are not working and the other treatments are not working. Speaking of opioids, those are our downers, by the way. Those kill 35,000 people per year, and half of those deaths come from prescription drugs. What about a drug like marijuana? We've got uppers, we've got downers, and the other classification we have is called the all-arounders. Marijuana falls into that group. You can't overdose on it, right? So it's not as bad. Wrong. Like every other drug, it affects your judgment, your motor coordination, your reaction time, and 35% of high school seniors are using it. Here's what 10 years of marijuana use does to your brain. I'll explain why the brain looks that bad in a few minutes, but sort of take that in. So it's no surprise that we're starting to see reports from Colorado and Washington, where marijuana has been legalized, that marijuana has replaced alcohol as the leading cause of accidental deaths in teens, and the teens showing up in ERs testing positive for marijuana has doubled. That's not sensational journalism, that's facts from the medical community. And there are plenty of other things that will fry our brains just as surely as the hard drugs do. So let's look at those. Here's an addiction that pulls in more money than Hollywood every year. It grosses more money than the NBA, Major League Baseball and the NFL combined. If you participate in this addiction, it doubles your likelihood for divorce. It shrinks your brain. It shrinks your libido. Quite frankly, it shrinks other parts of your anatomy. It's become a worldwide epidemic. I think of it as a sort of silent plague. You already know what I'm talking about, right? Pornography. I wish I weren't talking about it, but we have to talk about it. This is what it does to your brain. The image on the far right is a brain addicted to pornography. Because viewing porn floods our brain with dopamine, just like cocaine gets our brain to flood with dopamine. It literally overloads the brain. So your brain responds by trimming back the dopamine receptors, so it can't be so easily overwhelmed again. When your brain gets that massive of a rush for that extended period of time, it's going to respond. It's not designed to be overloaded with dopamine. So it trims back. It trims back important stuff. And by the way, when it trims back, you've heard people are chasing their first high. Have you ever heard that expression? They never find that first high again because your brain says, we're never going to let that many dopamine receptors be out there and vulnerable again. Now, unfortunately, pornography affects 80% of young men. That's probably not surprising. But what's even more shocking is that 50% of men over the age of 50 regularly view porn. That's horrible for our brain. I mean, it literally damages our brain, but it absolutely also fuels prostitution, sex trafficking, child slavery. The FBI reports that over 100,000 children are sold into sexual slavery and prostitution every year in the US alone. 100,000 kids. If you look at the numbers worldwide, it's 1.2 million. That's just a number I don't even know. That just hit my clicker. Let's move on. It's just so disturbing. Of course, most pornography is viewed on screens, such as smartphones and tablets, and shared over social media. Now, computers, I got one up here, and social media are not bad in and of themselves, but people can become addicted to them just like anything else, and that's the problem. So who is addicted to their smartphones? Evidently, the majority of the senior class went on retreat, but it is close to 100%. 50% of teens report feeling addicted. If you go and ask teenagers, do you feel addicted to your phone? Half of them will tell you, yeah, I feel addicted, but guess what? As in most things, teens underestimate by half. So it's actually 80, 90% have the behavior of an addict, at least mildly addicted. 80% of teens check their phones hourly all day long. You know what? Parents aren't much different. 70% of them check their smartphones all day long, every hour. There's almost no difference in use. Are there any differences between teen and parent screen time and social media use? Not really. Parents spend about 8 hours a day. Older teens spend about 9, and preteens spend about 8 hours a day on screen, on TVs, tablets, smartphones, social media sites. I don't know when they're sleeping. Now, people who use smartphones engage in roughly 75 sessions per day when they bring the thing out and do something with it. That's the average. That's roughly once every 10 minutes all day long. Now, the average amount of time that the average times a person will touch their smartphone is 3,000 touches per day. A heavy user touches their smartphone 5,000 times per day. Thank you. Now, 35% of households with kids say screen time is a daily argument. I think that's an underestimated number. It's probably higher than that. And with the rise of social media use, especially over the past decade, we've seen concurrent rising trends in people reporting feelings of anxiety, depression, and suicide. For the previous 2 years, suicide rates in teens had stabilized and actually started to drop. Over the last decade, it started to rise. Is social media causing it? You have to draw your own conclusions, but I'll point you to two very prominent social media giants who believe it is. just this week, in fact, this was in the headlines. But the ex-president of Facebook and the ex-vice president of Facebook have both left the company this year. And they say the site is engineered to be addictive. And in their remorse, they are publicly speaking out against Facebook and other social media sites. This week, Vice President Chamath Palihapitiya spoke at Stanford. And the quote in the headline here says, "Social media is ripping our society apart. There's no dialogue, there's no real discussion, there's no real value in this." He deleted his Facebook account. More to the point, the ex-Facebook president, Sean Parker, says the site is only there to exploit you and your relationships. He says, quote, "God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains," end quote. But of course, we actually do know what it's doing to our children's brains. It does basically the same damage as cocaine. Now, cocaine does a lot of other things to your body that social media doesn't do, but to your brain, it does basically the same thing. Too much exposure gives you slower processing speed. It gives you reduced willpower. We have to study it more because this is new, but it also appears that it's going to increase your odds for schizophrenia, depression, and dementia. No surprise when you see those brain scans, right? Now, regardless of social media, just too much screen time, period, physically shrinks the cortical thickness of your frontal lobe. Shrinking parts of your brain is not a good thing. Let me give you one more social media caution. Brian shared one about Snapchat. I'm going to share one that is, frankly, I'll say worse. Sexting. Snapchat is promulgating the sexting crisis that most of us probably aren't even aware exists. 20% of kids are sending nude or semi-nude photos of themselves to each other. It's about 50-50 boys and girls. We now have a generation of kids walking around with child porn on their devices. And those pictures aren't going to be gone in a year or 2 or 5 or 10 years. We've never seen anything like this before in the history of the planet. Now, all of these dopamine overloading experiences physically shrink our brain's pleasure centers, and they make it increasingly more difficult to feel real and lasting pleasure. I could go on and on about all other addictions, such as alcohol, that's 17 million of us addicted to that, tobacco, 36 million, shopping. Compulsive buying disorder afflicts more people than depression. 40% of American households have $16,000 in credit card debt on average. Some people get into that kind of debt under duress, but that number's way too big. We're not taking good care of ourselves. We spend, as a society, $500 billion a year on gambling. And if you can't relate to anything I've said so far, there's got to be at least one person in the room like me who's a workaholic. We spend more than 60 hours a week working. We don't use all our vacation time. 30% of us come home with migraine headaches regularly. We're working too much. Just a little anthropological side note, but our ancestors used to work on average 3 hours a day for shelter and food. Look what we do today. We've really advanced, haven't we? But I do have time for 2 more crippling addictions that I want to discuss, and then we'll get to how the brain, yeah, you're going to love these. You already know. And then I'm going to talk to you about how we get unaddicted from these nightmares, because the brain can become unaddicted. But I got to tell you first how bad the problem is. Don't hate me. I wrote that in my notes. We have to talk about caffeine and sugar, we really do. Thank you, she's nodding her head like, yeah, we do. Now, I know many of us have quite the affection for our morning cup of coffee. My buddy's visiting from out of town. We're driving around today, and he says, there's a Big on every corner. Yeah, the first time I went to Washington, D.C. 15, 20 years ago, I noticed that there was a Starbucks on every corner. And I thought, man, caffeine kind of runs our society. But what is the caffeine actually doing that's in that cup of coffee? Now, you can find research on both sides saying caffeine's good for you, you need some, or caffeine's bad for you, you should stay away from it. We need to wait and see how that research ultimately bears out, but we can all agree on some things. First and foremost, caffeine is not a good substitute for sleep. You're designed to sleep. The National Highway Safety Traffic Administration attributes as many deaths to drunk driving as they do drowsy driving. Technically, when caffeine enters the brain, it immediately goes to work blocking a receptor site. I'm going to talk about neurons and neurotransmitters in a second. Blocking a receptor site for a drug that's in your brain, naturally occurring drug called adenosine that is there to help you feel tired and relaxed and help you fall asleep at night. Well, caffeine goes in and blocks that right away, and then it tricks the rest of your brain into producing adrenaline. It's like putting a block of wood under your brake pedal. Now, the brain does not like being tricked, and it keeps trying to compensate for all of these things and reach some kind of equilibrium, which is why it takes more and more and more caffeine. I see some guilty nods out there to stimulate your brain. I had a good friend who was up to a pot of coffee a day. 20 years ago, I was up to a pot of coffee a day. And again, it's a very similar story with us in sugar. It's almost an identical story. Now, sugar itself is a carbohydrate. We need carbs. Carbs are not bad. Almost all of our energy comes from carbohydrates. Every time before I go for a mountain bike ride, I throw a third of a cup of water and a half a teaspoon of salt in my bottle, shake it up, and that's my fuel for my ride. We need carbs. We need some sugar. But the problem with sugar, which by the way is artificially packed into 80% of the food in our grocery stores, is that it's just so incredibly addictive. Why do you think we love it so much? In fact, in lab experiments, rats who we train to become addicted to cocaine, we get them addicted to heroin. There's a knowing nod up here. When they're presented, they also become addicted to sugar. When they're presented in a situation where they can run either to their cocaine-laced water, their heroin-laced water, or the Oreo cookies in the back, they make a beeline for the Oreo cookies. They rip the lid off and suck all the cream filling out. Just like me and you. They really do. But we're not lab rats, so, can't be more addictive than cocaine for us. It's not. It's not. It's equally addictive for us. Feel better? Yeah. So when sugar or cocaine hits your brain, it lights up the pleasure centers, the dopamine receptors like a Christmas tree. You feel good. And you can see these brain scans that show that sugar and cocaine activate the exact same areas of the brain. The brain knows almost no different, right? You can't OD and have a heart attack from sugar that we know of. You can get that from cocaine, but in the brain knows no difference. Now, am I just Chicken Little? The sky is falling. Do they, make a shorter, younger, better-looking version of Father Steve and put him up here? Just teasing. Self-deprecating to the end. Self-deprecating to the end. Guys, I'm not Chicken Little saying the sky is falling. It's already fallen. It's already fallen. Now, excessive sugar intake, which is related to obesity, is killing us. 30 years ago, 10% of us in this country were obese. Today, 35%. There are some genetic issues with obesity, but it doesn't account for that kind of a jump. And by the end of the next decade, that number is going to jump to 50%. What's the problem? Obesity resulting from excessive sugar and dopamine overloads, like every other drug I've talked about here, stifles your ability to feel normal levels of pleasure and happiness, just like in cocaine abuse. Harvard tracked over 170,000 people over 10 years. Here's what they found with people that struggle with obesity. You're at 20 times the risk for diabetes, which is the 7th leading cause of death. You're 6 times more likely to develop high blood pressure. Your risk for heart disease goes up 81%. And it looks more and more like the number 2 cause of cancer behind smoking is obesity. If 170,000 people isn't enough for you, let me tell you what the New England Journal of Medicine just published, a meta-analysis that looked at 500,000 people. If this one doesn't scare you straight, I don't know what will. If you're obese at 40, you increase your odds of mortality between the ages of 50 and 70 by 300%. Now I'm going to talk about how we can rewire the brain. But I just have to say, you can cut that risk in half by walking 30 minutes a day. Okay, so we're addicted. So how does this happen so easily? I think you're starting to understand that when we flood the brain with dopamine, we get problems. But to get to the solutions, I want to take us into a little bit closer look at the brain itself. So you've probably never done this before. You know how big your brain is? Put your hands together like that. That's how big your brain is. That's what's sitting inside your skull. That's about the size of your brain. No trying to inflate that. I see a few of your... I'm not that funny. It's got to be the wine. Okay. Some other interesting things about your brain. It's basically 3 pounds of fat and water. And your brain is made up of blood vessels, neurons, and these little support cells called glia. And you've got so much blood going through your brain. You've got 100,000 miles of blood vessels in your brain. That's enough blood vessels to go around the earth 12 times. Okay? Now that blood is taking oxygen and other nutrients to the 200 billion neurons and glial cells in there. 200 billion. Some of those neurons, by the way, are up to 6 feet long. Now, 200 billion cells, that's a really big number. We have no frame of reference for that. But that's as many stars as there are in the Milky Way galaxy, about 200 billion. And each of those neurons likes to make connections with other neurons. In fact, each neuron wants to make up to 10,000 connections with other neurons. That means you have over 100 trillion connections in your brain. 100 trillion crossroads, 100 trillion places where cognitions are created and neurotransmitters are shared. 100 trillion is 10 times the number of the galaxies in the known universe. There's a lot going on in there. These hundreds of billions of neurons are communicating at these trillions of connections using little chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. You've heard me talking about one a lot already, dopamine. There's a little over 100 of these neurotransmitters running around in your brain, but about 10 of them do 99% of the work. You may have heard of some of these, norepinephrine and epinephrine, serotonin, and others. Now, the interplay of dopamine, serotonin, and adrenaline are what largely account for our mood. Now, mood-regulating drugs like SSRIs, those are the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and the SNRIs, the norepinephrine management drugs, those are the second most prescribed class of drugs in the US. Mood-regulating drugs are the second most widely prescribed class of drugs in the US. The number one most prescribed class of drugs is lipid regulators. Number two, mood. Why? Because 25% of us are walking around with clinical levels of anxiety and depression. 25%. So we need to be very careful about what's getting into our bloodstream and our brain. We need to take care of our brain. Even though your brain is incredible, it's also this tiny, sensitive little organ. Hence why it has such an important protective shell around it. It's only 2% of your body weight, but it consumes 20% of your body's blood and oxygen. There's no pain receptors in the brain, so technically brain surgery doesn't hurt. It produces enough electricity to power a light bulb, or in the case, Father Steve, maybe two. Threw it back at you. Now, we used to think all kinds of weird and crazy things about the brain. We used to think you could measure someone's intelligence by measuring the size of their cranium. We really did. This is back in the bloodletting days. We used to think you could tell personality by the shape. Yeah. And I have to say we, as a social scientist, unfortunately, these are my ancestors in the field. We also used to think, that the brain stopped growing after adolescence. We're all taught the brain basically is done cooking around your early 20s. Well, that's not true. It keeps growing your whole life. Your whole life, your brain is growing. It grew 3 times its size in the first year of life, and it's been roughly the same size sort of on the outside since then. But as long as you've been experiencing, learning, living, you are producing and connecting new neurons in your brain. This is Nola Ox, 95 years old, the oldest college graduate. Her brain was still growing. By the way, I do have to give you one little footnote here on sleep again. When you starve yourself from sleep, which more than 30% of us do, it stifles your hippocampus's ability to produce new neurons, which you need to do new learning. You're not getting enough sleep, you're not going to be able to learn. Think about what happens in these hallways with the kids who are not getting enough sleep. And we're expecting them to learn 6, 7, 8 hours a day. They've got to get sleep. Sleep is critical. My wife is teaching me this, the sleep thing. Now, we used to think we only use 10% of the brain. Not true. Maybe 10% of what's its potential, but certainly not 10% of the brain. We use the whole enchilada. Thank you. Now, since we use the whole brain, we actually need the whole brain. We need the whole brain to be whole as well. And unfortunately, as we've already seen evidence of, part of what's going on with addiction is that addiction damages our brains. It damages them functionally, and it damages them functionally and physically. Shrinks them down, turns areas off, and stops them from communicating well with other parts of the brain. Now, the part of our brain that addiction hits the hardest is our cerebral cortex. And in particular, one of the lobes of our cerebral cortex, the frontal lobe. Now, the frontal lobe obviously sits up front here. That is an important part of your brain. They're all important, but this one is kind of what makes us distinctly persons in a sense. It's the seat of executive decision making. It's the newest part of the brain on the block. It's responsible for forecasting, for logical and rational decision making. It's kind of like your CEO and your executive leadership team. It's sort of the brains of the brain's operations. Yeah, that wasn't that funny. Okay. But the cerebral cortex, this outer layer, and a frontal lobe beaten down by addictions, it just effectively sends the executive leadership team out on the street. They're gone. And when they're gone, who's there left to run the business? The college interns. Yep. The college interns live in a different part of our brain called the limbic system. The limbic system is the seat of emotional processing. Okay? Now, when the frontal lobe is taken offline, you just forfeited your ability to regulate your impulsivity or do any rational thinking or decision making. Your limbic system is awesome. It helps you do amazing things. It helps you empathize with other human beings. It's a great part of your brain. It's just horrible at deciding if you should drive home after another drink or if you should just hop online for one more YouTube before you go to bed. It's not good at that stuff. The brain can bounce back. Fortunately, we can get the frontal lobe back online. We can get the CEO and the managers back in the boardroom running things. Your brain is incredibly resilient. It can recover from addictions of any kind. Any of the addictions I've talked about so far tonight, you can recover from physically and functionally. It can do major healing. It can reorganize, it can bounce back. We call the brain's ability to do this shape-shifting. We call it neuroplasticity. It means your brain is flexible. It's not fixed. You could find a psychology textbook from 60 years ago that said the brain is fixed at a certain point. Intelligence is fixed, IQ is fixed, the size is fixed. All of that is untrue. It's all absolutely been proven false now. It just hasn't really hit the popular media yet. Your brain is flexible. Now, it does like to put certain parts and certain functions on automatic. It likes to automatically assign responsibilities to certain areas of the brain. It does do that. It puts hearing into your temporal lobe. Your temporal lobe is responsible for hearing. Your occipital lobe in the back of your head is responsible for vision. But if you don't have either of those abilities, your brain doesn't just let that part of the unused part go unused. It says, hey, let's use that part of the brain to support another function. Now, that means you can get visually impaired folks who have heightened auditory processing. Of course they would. They have more brain matter dedicated to it. Not all, but many will. And that's for people who are born deaf or become deaf. The brain rewires. It also does it for vision. For people who are hearing impaired, born hearing impaired, or become hearing impaired, they get better visual processing. They get better visual processing. They get thicker optic nerves. They can literally, physically see more out of their peripheral vision than those of us with full hearing can. Now, even when the brain is severely damaged from things like strokes and language is lost, you can get your language back because you can learn to speak out of the singing part of your brain. Who knew? You sing out of a different part of your brain than you speak from. And we teach people to speak again out of that part of the brain. And CNN said it's true, so it's got to be true. Now, brains can be rehabilitated. I've said they can bounce back. You want to see what rehabilitated brains look like, they're on the far right. They look less and less like honeycombs, but it takes a while, you guys. Here's what a brain scan looks like from someone on the left. That's a healthy brain. In the middle is what the brain looks like after quitting cocaine for 10 days. And on the far right is what the brain looks like after quitting cocaine for 100 days. You can almost see the CEO and her executive leadership team working their way back into all the departments. They're coming back in. It takes time, though. And we get our brains physically unaddicted relatively the same way we got them addicted. We start creating new neural pathways, just like we do when we learn something new. When we start running new thinking and new behaviors over and over again, we literally start to establish a new neural network. Now, we know that neurons that consecutively and repeatedly fire together, wire together. They become a habit. And while you're developing those new thinking patterns and new habits, the old ones are decaying. The process of creating new neural pathways starts out small. It takes time for them to get established. But the more they are used, the more permanent they become. And those short-term wins turn more and more into long-term victories. Battle after battle, you begin to win the war. You're establishing a new neural network, new neural pathways in your brain. You let the old ones decay. They become overgrown and unused. Do you ever forget totally? Probably not. But the energy and the charge around those old neural networks that aren't visited often decays and becomes less, you have less of an appetite for it. Repetition is the key to learning. We have to do this over and over again. If the brain got really quickly addicted to something, it's because you had a very powerful drug like cocaine, which floods your brain in a way that it's just like fireworks going off in there with dopamine everywhere in your brain. Or you had an experience, then you radically formed some new neural pathways like overnight. And your thinking becomes entrenched. We've all had experiences, just a single experience that was so emotionally or physically or chemically charged, positive or negative, that we'll never forget it. Maybe like skydiving. And addictions are created by either having that single supercharged experience, or it could be the slow burn, the multiple recurring little experiences, like the case of getting little buzzes in your pocket when you get a Facebook like every 10 minutes or 20 minutes all day long. Some supercharged experiences can help us begin to break from our addictions. For some people, getting a DUI and spending a night in jail is enough to make them go cold turkey forever. But for some of us, it isn't enough. More often, we have to do the ongoing, steady immersion into new thinking and behaviors so that they become our new pattern of thought, our new neural network, our new daily habits. Guys, it's certainly harder to look for happiness down the road less traveled, especially when there's such certain and immediate gratification from a glass of wine and a few Oreo cookies. It's true. It certainly takes more energy to resist that easy path and spend the hard work and the long hours of changing our way of thinking, our habits, what we eat, who we recreate with, how we talk to ourselves. All of that takes time and energy. But the road less traveled really does, in the end, produce a more durable form of happiness and joy. Matthew wrote, "Wide is the path that leads to destruction, and narrow is the way that leads to life." Take a look around. If you're living like the majority culture, you can guess which path you're on. But an addicted brain, frankly, has a hard time caring about any of that philosophy I just shared with you. I know. I've been having this conversation with people who are addicted to things for over 15 years. Their frontal lobe is offline. They're not rational. They're not motivated in the same ways that they could otherwise be. So what could possibly motivate the interns to give the reins back over to the CEO? It really is the truth. The truth, the undeniable truth that their way of life is destructive and that their happiness really is in jeopardy. The interns think we're having fun today, but they have a hunch that they really don't know how to run this business, and they're going to be unemployed in 3 to 6 months if they don't get somebody else in there. I have clients who sit in front of me, especially my court-mandated clients, who I would call alcoholic, but they don't have to use that word, I don't either. And they say, well, I'm not alcoholic. And I say, okay, well, you can call it what you want, but you're unemployed now from drinking on the job. You got a DUI on your record. And you got to come see me once a week for an hour. We got some problems we can talk about. I wish I could tell you the magic recipe for how to get free from an addiction, but it's literally different for everyone. There are as many ways out of addiction as there are ways into it. For some, it means cutting up the credit card or freezing it in a block of ice. For others, it might mean putting parental monitoring on your own devices or your kids' devices, or just getting rid of them altogether. Maybe we don't just join a walking group at the office, we start one to get that 30 minutes in a day. Maybe we go home tonight and we remove all the sugar-packed food from our cabinets and limit our shopping to just the perimeter of the grocery store where the real food lives. My wife can tell you what a sugar addict I used to be. I lived on 2 bowls of cereal a day and fast food in the middle. And to me now, cereal is a lifeless, overbaked grain sprayed with sugar and vitamins. I actually still crave it now and then. My grandfather worked at Kellogg. It's in my genes. But you know what? I actually hate it more than I crave it. I really do. Now, the actions everyone takes will be different for everyone. And I don't know what your path out of addiction looks like exactly. But I can tell you the first 2 steps that absolutely everyone has to take in order to begin changing that pattern of thinking, good or bad, in your life. And the very first step is humility. It's less an actual step, it's more of a disposition. It's the virtue of laying down. It's not surrendering to the addiction, it's submitting to accepting the truth. This is what it looks like. Several years ago, I started going on retreats with my brother-in-law to a monastery down south. And there we have the opportunity to sit in front of the Blessed Sacrament. And one of those retreats, the brother said, I invite you to come down and prostrate yourself fully on the floor in front of the Blessed Sacrament. And I thought, I don't know if I would feel comfortable doing that. I can kneel. I won't sit, that doesn't feel right. But kneeling is something I've done in front of the sacrament. I can do that. But as I knelt, eventually I felt like I wanted to lay down in front of Jesus, and I did. And it felt like home. It felt like this is how it's supposed to be. Humility is that inner acknowledgement that we have a problem. We're not minimizing it. We're not maximizing it. We're not telling ourselves we're bad because of our addictions. We're not. We're not shaming ourselves. We're just simply acknowledging that we have an addiction. That's the first step. Without it, there's no real awareness that there's a problem. So why would I even think about possible solutions? Why should I put parental monitoring on my phone or turn it into a dumb phone? There's no real problem. I'm not addicted. Someone who doesn't think they're addicted has no problem, hence needs no solutions. Now, many of us in the room are already sitting here going, yeah, I probably got a few addictions. So maybe step 1 is not as hard as step 2. Step 2 is going to be really hard. You're probably not going to like it, but here it is. You have to go public. Step 2 is that you announce your addiction to someone who can help you. That is always step 2. You can start by just telling one friend. You can tell them, look, I'm addicted. I'm not pretty sure I'm addicted. I know I'm addicted. Step one, done. I've actually got some ideas about how I could stop, but I'm going to need your support. That's step two. Maybe you join a support group. Maybe you call the family meeting and you have the intervention for yourself. Frankly, the more people you announce it to, the bigger your support group, the more accountability you have, the greater your chance of success. Now, the temptation here will be to keep the truth of your addiction to yourself, and maybe even try and solve it on your own. That's not going to work. That's pride. I know it. I've sat in a confessional with priests who I felt, there's a line out there, I got to get through my confession quickly. And once I said, it's just pride, Father. It's just pride. That's basically what it was. Pride doesn't help. To paraphrase St. James, my namesake, he said, God opposes the proud but shows favor to the humble. Because why? Because pride leaves no room for relationship. That's the problem with pride. You're going to need relationships to get through that addiction. You're going to actually have to ask for help. Step one and step two are really hard. Admitting we have an addiction is not an easy thing. Announcing it to someone or a lot of someone's who can help me doesn't sound like fun either. For me, sitting in the confessional, usually month after month, confessing the worst parts of myself, that hurts. It's also a glorious experience, but it's a painful experience too. But we need that perspective. And we really can only get that from another person. We can't see our own blind spots. But a priest or a counselor often can, and when they do, we begin to uncover the lies, which are the cornerstones of our self-defeating identities and behaviors. You didn't think you were going to get through a talk on addiction without that on the screen, did you? Really? Yeah. For those of you who are visiting, I'm a new member of Church of the Resurrection, maybe 2 years. We've been talking about this for a good while. Only been a year, but feels like a couple years. But it's lies, you guys, it's lies. Now, those of you who have been on the Healing the Whole Person retreat or read the book know that the source of our suffering is rooted in lies. In psychology, we don't call it lies, we call it irrational beliefs. Same thing. It's lies that we believe about ourselves, lies we believe about others, and quite frankly, lies we believe about our Creator and His plan for us, if He even has one, we wonder. Now, these lies are believed either because we aren't aware of them, or we don't understand them to be false, but most likely it's because, in my experience, we just stubbornly hold on to our own lies because we have a fear of change. Now, some of the most common lies that I've heard from people are that we believe we are not lovable and that we believe we are not powerful. And those two lies alone, thinking I'm not lovable and I'm essentially powerless to do anything to change that, is a recipe for total despair. I had a client recently who was referred to me because she was every day cutting herself. She had scars all over her body. She was very suicidal. In fact, she had written suicide notes to several members of her family. And in sitting down with her, we got to uncovering those two lies. I'm not lovable, I'm not powerful, and we added a third one in her case, which was, I'm not beautiful. She had had an incident as a kid where she got blamed for something instead of her siblings. And from that moment on, she decided that she wasn't the pretty one in the family, she wasn't the smart one, she was essentially unlovable, and that she was now, more than a decade into debilitating anxiety and depression, powerless to change her life. It's no wonder she felt suicidal. Those are lies. Nobody who sees herself as beautiful work of art cuts herself. Nobody who thinks they are powerful enough to move mountains stays stuck in a pattern of harm. Guys, we are beautiful and powerful and intelligent. We are made in the image and likeness of God. She uncovered and renounced those lies. Now, that whole process of exploring your soul with another person takes an incredible amount of vulnerability. Nobody bears their soul, warts and all, from a position of pride. The cost of admission to that kind of vulnerability is humility. We can be made whole, which is why I pray that we all develop the humility to acknowledge our weaknesses and that we develop the courage to ask for help in facing them. I am so grateful that we have in the life of Jesus a man who is the perfect example of honesty and humility. True joy and lasting peace is waiting for us if we join him on that path of his unending love. Thank you.
Jim's going to field Q&A. We got time. Questions?
Questions about addiction or healing addiction or? Yep, I saw this hand first and then we'll go up to Joe. Yeah.
There was you don't have to go to it or anything, but there was a picture that you showed that showed dopamine lit up with cocaine and then dopamine lit up with sugar. And I was curious about what it looks like for the brain to be lit up with dopamine in a healthy way, whether that healthy way exists and how it would look like. I mean, dopamine exists for a reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh yeah. The picture I think you're referring to might have been the image of the two brains with the green. That was showing the pleasure centers that are activated by cocaine and sugar. So it's not telling you exactly what's happening, just that it's happening in both places. It's happening in the same place in both. Cocaine is a drug that floods the brain with, just picture fireworks going off in your brain. That's what cocaine does. So I think, is your question, what is a healthy amount of dopamine supposed to look like in terms of firing off? I don't think we have brain scans that I have seen that show what that looks like, except the earlier 3D images that show the entire brain no parts of the brain have retreated. That's why we get that honeycomb-looking brain. They haven't retreated from dopamine flooding. Yeah. Dr. Joe.
So you gave that example of that young lady that you had experience of counseling with.
A louder, please.
I'll repeat that. Yeah.
So in that example you gave of the young lady that you were counseling, and this experience of her life where she was blamed for something that should have been blamed on the other siblings. Mm-hmm. I think the vast majority of us have an experience like that in our life that doesn't lead to that end result. Is there, what separates the people that fall into that addiction from the people that don't from those same experiences? What's the difference?
Well, can I answer that two different ways? Yes, I can, because I'm in charge up here. There isn't a group of people who have experiences like that who don't go form addictions. There isn't that group. So if you're asking me what's the difference between people who form addictions after having an abusive childhood or an experience where they say I felt abused or misused, their addictions look different, but we all are, I hate to use this phrase, this little cliche now, walking wounded. So in one sense, I'm rebutting your metaphor that, why do some of us not have addictions and some of us do? Or some of us have an experience where we don't feel, where a parent said something flipped to us and we didn't get hurt by it. There isn't that group of people, I don't think, not in my experience. But to be more fair to your point, why do some of us take it so hard and others don't? I mean, some of that has to do with the resiliency that we've developed up to that point. We know we can predict PTSD before we send somebody overseas because we know what their coping skills are before they go. If they have a lot of resiliency and a lot of coping skills, they're going to experience horrific trauma and they're going to come out of it okay because of who they were before they experienced the trauma. So part of that is the age that it happens at. The younger you are, the less coping skills you have, the less resiliency you have. I'm sure some of it will come down to just genetic stuff too at some point, but just the experiences we've had up to that point. Now they get reinforced because people want to reinforce that identity. I'm not loved, there's more evidence. I'm not loved, there's more evidence, and that's called sort of confirmation bias. I already knew it, so all I can see is the data that shows me my one lie is true. we all do sort of confirmation bias. Even when we buy a new car, we see it everywhere now, and we think it's the greatest car, and everybody's driving it. I mean, we all do that in different domains in our life. So, we can answer. I can talk more later. Yeah, CJ.
It's kind of a two-pointed question. One, I'm making an assumption that you can't talk or don't talk about God and Jesus in a lot of your things, a lot of your sessions. And two, if that assumption is correct, is it more difficult to actually make breakthroughs with people when you don't talk about God and Jesus as much?
It's super difficult to make breakthroughs quickly. Yes, you're right. I ask. I start with questions like, do you have faith? Do you participate in religion? I ask those kinds of questions. But even if people believe in Jesus, their idea of who Jesus is could be very different from mine. So yeah, I think it speeds the process up if they have a relationship with Jesus, because he heals faster. Frankly, I've been a therapist for 15 years. Before I went on the Healing the Whole Person retreat myself and read the books, and I read a lot of stuff and went through the experiences myself a couple of times as a client, I used to think, I got a client here, I got to try to get them managed today so that they're not a total mess, and try to get them back next week, and we'll, over the course of 4 weeks, things are going to start looking better. Now, my goal with every client who sits down in front of me is, I want you healed today before you leave this office. That's my goal now, because I know it's possible. Before, I didn't even think it was possible. But it's more possible with people who have a relationship with Christ, yeah. Absolutely. Another question down here. Yes, sir.
I just kind of have a comment. The doctor up here was mentioning how maybe these early experiences don't manifest themselves as addictions or anxiety or depression. Are you familiar with the work of Howard Schubiner?
Howard Schubiner, no.
Okay, I'm just beginning to learn, about this whole area, but there's also manifestations as far as physical pain, and this has developed a self-therapy that people can use or can use in conjunction with a counselor, where a lot of these emotional traumas or physical traumas later manifest themselves in unexplained physical pain.
Oh, sure.
A lot of people who have conditions like fibromyalgia
Yeah.
or pelvic pain, foot pain, leg pain, chronic back pain, and so on, where there's not really a tissue-based or disease-based good diagnosis for it, and he's seemed to be having great results with people through this neuroplasticity and reprogramming these neural pathways.
Yep, I agree. Thank you for sharing that the brain or the body is exacerbating physical illnesses as a result of what's going on from emotional experiences. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
And you talked a lot about being addicted to substances such as like sugar or alcohol or cocaine.
Yeah.
What about like addictive thought patterns? Because we see in the Bible it talks a lot about our thoughts, and a lot of people would get into like a cycle of self-defeating thoughts. And is that as highly addictive as substances on the outside?
Well, it doesn't have a physical, it does have a physical component, frankly, because it's a neural network that you're running. It's a software that you're continually telling yourself. So yeah, part of the self-help world will tell you to change your self-talk, to put affirmations up in your home. There's all kinds of techniques you can use to start to change the way you think about yourself. Some of that is very popular now in positive psychology. There's a movement now in psychology to study wellness instead of illness. How about that? And one of the things that's being talked about in positive psychology is fixed mindset versus growth mindset. Plenty of people are walking around going, I'm just made this way. I'm just made to be unhappy, or I'm just negative and I'll never change. But those are lies. We're all made to grow and flourish. So yeah, that's definitely occurring. So I'll round, but I saw somebody in the back. Michael, yeah. Yes, sir.
Three comments.
Yes, sir.
What is, we have to assume that what you are presenting is actually factual, based on what you're making a presumption, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, the idea of power, most of us don't have real power. Those who do can exercise it and are unaware of the fact that they are doing stuff to other people. It's a presumption. My last question, quote unquote, is someone who does have a sense of power, they They refer to me as a whiner and complainer, and you are just a pile of horseshit. What kind of a person is doing that?
Well, let's go to the data for a moment. I didn't put footnotes in here so you can go find the data, but it's all easily available through places like PubMed, the CDC. A lot of my data comes from the Center for Data, that's not the Center for Data. Disease Control. Yep, you can find a lot of that data in the CDC. Yes, anybody who's up in front as a purveyor of truth, you should check their data, no question. To your second point, or maybe it was the third point, what do you say to someone who is a bully? Is that what you're describing?
I'm not describing who
Yeah.
that individual is, only their attitude toward others. You are a whiner, you are a complainer, and you are a pile of bullshit.
If somebody says that to another person, we call that projection. I'm being a little flip. But we have that term for a reason. It's because what are they doing in that moment? Whining, complaining, and acting like an unkind person. I won't use your metaphors, I'll use mine, but yeah. There was some over here. Yeah. And then
What would you say to the trend of schools, especially high schools, going more and more towards technology and away from textbooks, and what that will do to the generation of kids?
I wish I could prognosticate that. And I wish I could say, boy, I think we can get back to Little House on the Prairie if we just get rid of all the technology. You know, they had problems too. The technology's not going away, but we have to be super intelligent about how we're using it. And we're not historically very good at getting new tools in our hands and doing great with them all the time. So should the technology be in our classrooms, and to what extent should it be in there? I think we should be having these conversations. I think we have to be able to say to our kids, social media risk is huge. And here's why. These tools can be great. They can help save lives. The amount of technology we have available now does some things. Certainly improves our quantity of life, but we have to keep our eye on the prize of quality of life as well. So I just think we have to have, especially in the schools, principals and faculty extremely aware of what the issues are. 25% of their kids are suffering from clinical levels of anxiety and depression. Suicide is the #2 cause of death for teenagers. It's the #2 killer in a high school. Does the principal know that? Do the teachers know that? Are they doing anything about it? Are we saying to the kids, depression, suicide, can we use those words? Because they are thinking it. And a lot of them are doing it. So yeah, I think we have to just have the conversation. Siena Heights, where I teach, our motto is be bold, think higher. So I think we have to be bold, a little bit more bold than we have been. Siobhan, you had a question? No.
Would you be able to talk about ADHD medicines and effect on the brain?
A little bit, yeah. So here's the thing about ADHD, treating it psychiatrically or with drugs. That's one way to treat it. There are other ways to treat it, which literally take more time. Talking about biofeedback, for example, where a kid starts to train their brain to do something differently as a result of viewing images on a screen and learning to control what's happening, immediately getting feedback to how their brain is thinking and what they're doing. Now that means you got to drive your kid to therapy once a week and pay for that. And a prescription is covered by insurance, and it's a pill we can take every day. So you're going to get a similar effect out of both, but one is a different way of life. One is to take a pill and fix it, which I'm not against anybody who says, I'm so anxious I can't get out of my house, I'm so depressed I don't want to live. Go see your general practitioner, get a drug that helps so that you can go get psychotherapy, but that's a counselor talking, right? Because your brain isn't designed to have that kind of, I can't say it's not designed to have those drugs in there to help, but at the same time, there are other ways. And I think we have a duty to look at all the options, right? I always ask, I get a physical every year, and I ask my doctor, what's the latest and greatest if I tell you I'm not feeling good, anxious or depressed or something, and they'll say, well, I would just write you a prescription. That's it? Right here, right now? Yep. Okay. If you're taking more than 3 of these Xanax a week, I want you to come back because you can get addicted to them. That's the conversation. It's a little scary. There's other ways to deal with it. Yeah, and then we'll come across. Yep.
So, you're talking about ADHD, technology, the impacts on the brain. Are there correlations between these earlier diagnosis
Yeah.
and with technology screen time? What are those?
Well, when I started in this field, which wasn't that long ago, You couldn't diagnose anybody with ADHD if they weren't 6 years or younger. Couldn't do it. It wasn't in the DSM, which is the American Psychiatric Association diagnosing book. Now you can. But so why? Did we not have adult or teenage ADHD? Of course. We may have had those kind of symptoms, but now everybody wants to be diagnosed. I don't want to sound flip here. Nobody wants to be diagnosed with ADHD. But you're asking more about our society. Is the technology that we're interacting with, is it pushing this ADHD? I don't think I could probably give you an unbiased answer, so maybe I'll just have to pause there because I feel like I'm getting on a soapbox a little bit here. But in terms of, are those things good for the brain? The brain needs, it's not that it doesn't need screen time, it needs exercise, it needs healthy food, it needs oxygenated blood, it needs relationships, it needs a whole lot of other things that will make it resilient in the face of having spent so much time in those places. That's one way to answer that question. Yeah, there's a question in the middle here, yeah.
Yeah, you were talking about kids that are using a lot of the technology. Would you say that they're all hopelessly addicted, or that they're, or some able to manage the technology because they're genetically different than others? If they're able to do that, or are they all hopeless?
No, it's absolutely not. Well, I'm glad you asked, and I know you don't mean totally hopeless. It isn't hopeless. It's about the relationship that you have with the technology and how you see the technology. For me and my addiction of sugar, if I'm out traveling and somebody says, here's a bowl of cereal, I look at it differently now than I did 10 years ago. I think, whoa, I gotta be careful with this. I mean, sounds funny, but yeah, it was part of my sugar addiction. So it's the same thing with a smartphone. If you were to give one to a kid or take one into your own life, you should be thinking along the lines of, this could go really badly. I mean, you got the ex-vice president of Facebook and the president of Facebook saying, don't do this. Steve Jobs created the iPad and wouldn't let his kids have them. So they're dangerous. They're kind of like when you give your kid a rifle or a knife, you have that conversation. This is dangerous.
So when I raise my kids in technology, I grew up around technology, and a lot of people from my generation kind of evolved into the technology. I always believed in moderation. So I don't think my boys really like the fact that, when their friends were having flip phones, and when they were having sliders, and then they started having the smartphones, they didn't have those. They still were using a flip phone or something like that, because I wanted them to get used to some of the technology and try to learn how to manage it a little bit so that they weren't addicted to the technology. But I don't know that it really made a difference, because once they're out on their own, I mean, they can just go pick up the latest smartphone.
Sure. Well, I think it's like when they turn 16 and are able to drive. That's a lot of responsibility. You need to be careful. You could kill yourself or other people with this. It's that kind of conversation. If we don't think about social media or hardware like phones in the same way, I think we're probably doing them a disservice. Now, in particular with young men, I mean, this thing is a gateway to hell. I'll say it. It's a gateway to hell for a young man. If I would have had this as a teenager, there's no telling what my brain would have looked like. Sorry if that gets too personal for you, but this is just being real with you. I mean, I have a son, and my number one job is to protect him, and not so concerned what happens in the 60 or 80 years he's here. I'm hoping for eternity with him. So I don't care about the phone so much. He needs loving relationships, he needs peer groups, and if he's ostracized from them for not having a smartphone, I get that. But there's gonna be some other ones. I've made pacts with some of my friends now and our kids. We're not gonna let them have phones together, right? But, they're going to get them eventually. Yeah, thank you. I could name them publicly, and then that would be step 2, but I don't want to out them. All shots. Okay. Over here, there's a question. Yes, sir.
I really like the images you had of the brain.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
I guess what were those images, and what is that really showing you? Like those gaps or holes or
Mm-hmm. There's different ways we can do neural imaging, CAT scans, CT scans, MRIs, functional MRI, fMRIs. These SPECT scans are nuclear imaging. So that's kind of one of the newer kids on the block. It's been around for a few decades, frankly. But you can look, and I showed some MRI scans as well, not just SPECT scans. The SPECT scan is nice. It's that three-dimensional image, especially of the cerebral cortex, which is the part that's particularly damaged by addiction. Cocaine does things to your cardiopulmonary system, which are really bad, but that's other parts of your brain are dedicated to the cardiopulmonary system. But in terms of the cerebral cortex, yeah, I like those images because they show those. But you can find these yourself. You can read the articles. They are out there. I mean, I love that Michael challenged, are these numbers real? Yeah, they're real, and you can verify them yourself. I encourage you to do it, and you can find the sources. I didn't get this information by asking Google. I'm a professor. Professor means expert. I have a duty to tell the truth. I'm supposed to be a content expert. I wouldn't do it otherwise. Yeah. Other question in the back there. Yes, sir.
Two more questions.
Two more questions, yep. Go ahead, sir. Yep.
Okay. What I wanted to ask about was prayer. It would seem to me that prayer would bathe the brain in a beautiful light. Desire for prayer. Like if we have habits of prayer, like I know I'm going to say my night prayer, but there's a longing for that in advance. They seem like a human being is oriented for God par excellence.
Right.
And it seems like the human being can't be as beautiful as he can be without a profound life of prayer. The sacraments, holiness. Isn't that the true answer to these problems? Is conversion and a life bathed in prayer, a life in God, not having a substitution. But all these things are mere things that we use in the course of the day, but He's our supreme love, and so all this is properly ordered.
I can't agree with you more. We are wired for joy. We are wired for joy. God is love. What does that feel like?
Exactly.
We are wired for love. But you're right, we find it in all the wrong places. So what you're describing, how we get to that is actually step 4 in these stages of change. What do we actually do? How do we do that? I mean, prayer in somebody's can look different. Everybody's brain and their experience of that can look a little bit different. But to your point, yeah, we're wired for joy. And it is found in Oreo cookies. It is found in Mountain Dew. It is found in cocaine. It is. Those things just kill you. And they kill your ability to be a whole person. That's the problem with them. Yep. One more question. Yes. Yeah.
I feel like for me at least, almost anything can be addicting. Like if my bedtime routine is interrupted, like 2 days ago someone interrupted me and I was disproportionately annoyed with this person.
Yeah.
Like, and it's not so much caffeine in the morning as like if I don't have like hot something, then I'm like, I feel like my day started wrong. What do you feel about that? Do you feel like, I know that there's a good addiction, but do you think that there is good routine?
Oh, no.
Like, you know what I'm saying?
No, but there are good addictions. It's good to have things on automatic in the brain. It really is. The brain can do other things when things are on automatic. I sort of automatically automatically brush my teeth in the morning or at night. I automatically pray this time and that time of the day. I mean, there's things that sort of happen automatically that are good. I've done them so often that they are good habits for me. They're life affirming. Carrying a bottle of water around with me and getting 2 liters of water every day, that's a habit. I don't know if it's appropriate to have this in a nice place. Like, I'm not supposed to have any drinks in here, but but no, the brain, and my point in addiction was you get a hard, entrenched path. You just want that path to be the narrow path, the path of life. That's what you want entrenched in your thinking. Yeah. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate that. Yep.